Good morning and good afternoon, Excellencies. Good morning, good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Now we would like to switch gears and move into a substantive discussions as part of the regional platform. And there's no better way actually to do so other than really understanding the context and the progress that is being made in Africa when it comes to disaster risk reduction. Therefore, the title of this session is really a question. Is Africa on track to achieve the Sendai framework and its Africa program of action for the implementation of the Sendai framework in Africa? I'm really very pleased to have with me in this session my colleagues and friends, Mr. Gatkot Kai, who's the Disaster Risk Reduction Technical Coordinator at the African Union's Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment. I also pleased to have Ms. Cecilia Epira, who's the UNDP Senior Advisor, who's also present with us today. It's an honor to have them. If I'm just to begin with a few words, I think DRR progress in Africa has progressed quite well in recent years. I think we are actually nearing a behavioral change on the continent, with focus really beginning to shift from disaster management to disaster risk management. Almost all African countries have disaster risk reduction focal points or institutions. Many of them, about 28 countries, are striving to meet the Sendai framework targets, and about 28 of them have now begun to report on the Sendai framework monitor. So this is a positive development that's happening. So we'll also hear a little bit more from our presentations about the work that Africa is taking to address the Sendai priorities, including some of the emerging priorities in Africa that are really coming to light as we speak. The latest being the discourse on the need to strengthen anticipatory action to disasters with the support of advanced early warning, early action mechanisms. So there's a lot of good work happening there that we'll hear not only today, but throughout the conference. You'll also hear some of the progress that's being made about strategic operational issues that continue to be made, particularly in the context of the African Union Program of Action, which is being revised now. Of course, given the theme of this conference, which is towards disaster risk informed development for a resilient a resilient Africa in a COVID-19 transformed world, the issue of COVID-19 and the recovery from it is of critical importance. So we will hear some of the work that's being done with the African Union and our colleagues at UNDP to formulate a COVID-19 recovery framework on the continent. So with that, I would like to give the floor to my friend Kai, who will be able to sort of address the first question is, what kind of progress are we making on the continent of Africa when it comes to disaster risk reduction? Before Kai begins, I just encourage the listeners and participants to use the Q&A if you have any comments or questions, and we will field them to the speakers at a later stage. Kai, you're welcome. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Amjad, for that wonderful introduction and the brief background on the work that we have done so far on disaster risk reduction. Indeed, we have made substantial progress. So I will have a presentation that will highlight that progress we have made so far. I will start with the context and then the progress itself, some of the challenges and the way forward. Over the last 4 years, we undertook a very comprehensive exercise through the Africa Biennial reporting process. And in that report, we found out that the risk index, the continental risk index, is really increasing. And we disaggregated that risk index by regional economic communities. Some are doing better than others, but the overall risk index for the continent is on the rise. And dissecting views of different components of risk, such as exposure, have also increased. We have also seen that vulnerability is on the rise. Fairly enough, the coping capacity remained stable for the last 4 years, with good news. But on the bad side, it means that the coping capacities are not adequate to counter the growing risk index. In terms of progress, I will be presenting this also in two, one on the priorities areas and also by the targets. In terms of understanding disaster risk, a lot of work has gone into this, and the first one was the inaugural Africa report on disaster risk reduction, covering 2015-2018, and the link is available. So we also have the Africa Regional Assessment Report, which was undertaken by the UN Office for Africa. And as Amjad said, over 20 countries have already have risk profiles. This is encouraging. We also have established the Africa Science and Technology Advisory Group. This is going to be a game changer in terms of bridging the gaps between policies and science. We also have established the Africa Youth Advisory Board. This has been a key mechanisms in terms of spreading risk knowledge across the continent. So far through IAP, we have reached over 10,000 in just a span of 1 year. In terms of risk governance, a lot of progress has been made as well. Just building on Amjad highlight, we have so many countries having an institution in place. Also, REX have put in place policies and an institution, as well as at continental level. This is very, very encouraging. And I think this is all these policies, if you have a closer look, they all are forward-looking, and there is a significant shift from initially responding to disasters to sort of reducing risk and building resilience. This is really very encouraging. In terms of risk financing, you all know we have been also progressing in this area. The African Union established the African risk capacity to provide parametric insurance. This is a work in progress, but we also have a number of programs through international cooperation that are financing risk. One of them is the intra-ACP natural risk reduction programs, which will start very soon in January. Then we also have the Africa Disaster Risk Financing Initiatives, an initiative that is jointly supported by AFDB, the African Development Bank, and the African Risk Capacity. We also have CleanUp Africa, which is a joint initiative of the African Union, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank. We have the recent funding from the Italian government on multi-hazard early warning systems. We also have ongoing projects in the Sahel supported by the government of Sweden and jointly implemented with UNDP. These are important progress that are being made on risk financing. In terms of preparedness, it was mentioned several times that we are now establishing multi-hazard early warning systems. In African Union, we are establishing a 24-hour situation room. This is going to be inaugurated very soon. IGAD has established the operational center here in Nairobi, very encouraging. And ACMAT has also put in place advisory situation room. SADC has established an emergency and humanitarian operation center, which is now being hosted in Mozambique. These are important initiatives that are being put in place in early warning system. In terms of recovery, we are now embarking on a comprehensive disaster recovery framework that will also not look at COVID-19, but also other disasters. And my colleague Cecilia will come in later on. In terms of targets, we have 7 global targets, and we have a specific target for Africa. In terms of global target, we intend to reduce disaster mortalities by 2030. The current mortality that we have based on the Africa Biennial report is that the first 2 years of the Sendai, 2015, 2016, we recorded more than 31,000 mortalities. And in 2017 to 2018, this has increased to 36,000. Definitely, we are not making progress in that target. And in terms of target B, in the first 2 years, we have 58 million people displaced. And in 2017, 2018, that has reduced to almost 29 million. That is a significant reduction, almost 50% reduction, very encouraging. We hope to see this trend moving forward. In terms of target C, the direct economic loss, the first 2 years was more than 2 billion. The last 2 years, 8 billion. This is exponential rise, almost 4 times. Very discouraging as well. In terms of target D of the Sendai framework, this is very difficult, really. And I think that also highlighted the point that was made by Amjad before in terms of data. Countries are really struggling to collect multi-sectoral data on critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. But based on the insignificant data that we have seen an exponential rise of critical damage or damage to critical infrastructure. In terms of DRR strategies, we are also making progress in this area. And I will go briefly to the early warning systems. I already talked about it. We are also doing a lot of work here. In countries, there are efforts being made to put in place early warning system, but although there is still remain likely single hazard, so effort will need to be made to ensure that they are multi-hazard, or if not, they have to have some level of interoperability between different sets of early warning systems that exist at national level. In terms of international cooperation, really this is still very low, and a lot of effort need to be made to ensure that we accelerate international cooperation to respond to growing multidimensional risk. I would group the specific target of Africa into just one dashboard. The reds indicate that those countries are not achieving the targets, and the green, especially the darker green, indicate that those countries are achieving the target. So far you can see only 2 greens. That means 2 countries are on track in achieving the Africa specific targets. And you have a lot of reds on the dashboard. In terms of challenges, a collection of data is one of them. And again, there is still very limited investment in resilience. A lot of financing is still going to responding to emergencies, which is very unsustainable. And of course, disaster risk is on the rise and increasingly become and multidimensional. So there is really a need to ensure that financing is addressing those challenges. So that will be need to ensure that we have accelerated implementation of the POA and the Sendai framework, and priorities should be given to making DRR and resilience a development priority. We also need to ensure that establishing multi-hazard early warning systems and ensure interoperability across local, national, regional, and continental levels. Institutionalizing DRR at national and regional level should also be a very important priority moving forward. And of course, we need to ensure that we embark on a comprehensive recovery from COVID-19 and other disasters. I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kai, for this very interesting synopsis of the situation of disaster risk reduction in Africa, and for actually breaking it down into some of the priorities or all the priorities of the Sendai framework, and for highlighting also that in addition to the 7 global targets for the Sendai framework, Africa has 5 specific targets that are domesticated for the continent, and I was still struck with the comment that you made when it comes to international cooperation, that we are still in the disaster response mode rather than more addressing the root causes of the disaster problems that we have. So speaking of that, and speaking of root causes, I very much look forward to listening and inviting you to listen to Cecilia Pera, from the UNDP Senior Advisor, who will also bring us up to date on some of the work that's happening between UNDP, African Union, and other partners to address a real-time challenge that we have. And this is the issue of how to recover from COVID-19 in Africa. And I'm very honored to give the floor to Cecilia. Please go ahead, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Amjad, and thank you also, Kai, for your great presentation. I think it's a lot of food for thought as we move forward. And of course, COVID-19 complicates things even further for us as we discuss the progress that Africa is making towards achieving the Sendai framework. Maybe a bit of background before I start the presentation. The COVID-19 recovery strategy for Africa was started under one of the projects that Kai just mentioned, which is the Sahel Resilience Project, under the funding or the auspices of the Swedish government. And we've taken it forward, looking at the need and the continent in terms of how do we, as a continent, move forward beyond this common disaster that is affecting, has not left any household really untouched. So the presentation is about why we're doing this framework, but also some of the preliminary findings that we have. Thank you. So the outline of the presentation: what is the recovery framework? How is the process being undertaken? What are the preliminary results that we have and the preliminary recommendations, but also the next steps as we move forward. The recovery framework, this originates from post-disaster recovery. Some of you might be familiar with post-disaster needs assessment, PDNAs. And normally after PDNA, you would draft a post-disaster recovery framework to guide the actual recovery. And in the old times, of course, we would have a recovery master plan. But with this approach, this new approach, it goes beyond just the master plan. We're looking at what are some of the policy and institutional reforms that Africa needs to have in order to really resiliently recover from COVID-19? What are some of the programmatic investments that we need to have in place, and the financing mechanisms? Is it public financing? Is it from the donors? Is it from the financial institutions, or a combination of all of this? But also the governance, who's accountable for recovering from COVID-19? Who is held accountable? Who leads? Who coordinates? How do we coordinate to make sure that this is again done in a coherent manner? And what are the implementation arrangements? I mean, COVID-19 has reached all sectors: agriculture, transport. So how do you implement recovery from COVID-19 as well? But also the process, in terms of the process that we take with the recovery framework is, we do the assessments, we do the consultations before we actually prepare the recovery framework. The goals and objectives of this framework is to really guide resilient socioeconomic recovery efforts, at the continental, regional, and national levels, but it's also from a multi-risk perspective. How do we create preconditions for building resilient societies in Africa? The objectives is to assess the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 in the region, identify regional trends on the impact and the value of collective approach to address economic and human impacts of the pandemic, but also provide guidance to member states to plan and implement the COVID-19 recovery in the short term, in the medium, as well as the long term. But also, what are some of the transformational policy and agendas that we need to have or we need to adopt to effectively deal with the current crisis, but also address the future challenges. Now, who is the target audience for this recovery framework? Of course, the AUC is the one that commissioned this framework, but really it's targeting the member states to guide them and give them a kind of a framework, the parameters that we need, the minimum conditions we need as we take this journey of recovering against COVID-19. It also, of course, is relevant to the regional economic commissions, the UN agencies, development partners, and other institutions. Who are the main partners supporting the AUC in this framework? We have, of course, UNDP is leading this process, but we also have UNDRR on board, WHO, African Development Bank, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, African Development Bank. Those are kind of the main partners that we have on board. How is this process being prepared? One is, I don't know if I can have the presentation brought forward, the technical colleagues online, because I can't read. Thank you. How is it being prepared? The first stage is a scoping and situational assessment for the recovery framework. This process took between July and September 2021. And we've prepared an inception report, a situational assessment, but also a lot of the data coming in has enabled us to also create a knowledge repository. We are now in the second phase of drafting the recovery framework. This will take place, of course, now until end of the year. We are in the middle of conducting consultations with the member states, also doing some case studies, as well as then using this information to draft the recovery framework. The next step, which we envision between January and March, is supporting the African Union in endorsing the recovery framework. This will be done at the ministerial level, but also the advocacy and the dissemination of the recovery framework. In terms of the structure of the framework, it looks, of course, it starts with an introduction. It looks at the situational assessment. The situational assessment really looks at, what was the situation in Africa at the national level, at the regional level, and continental level before COVID-19 hit. What were the progresses that we were making, for example, in health, in agriculture, macroeconomic development, human development, and so on and so forth. And then we look at how has COVID-19 changed all of that? Are we still making progress or are we derailing? And then we look at the recovery strategies. What strategies do we need to have in place to go back to the situation we had in Africa before COVID-19, but also to build back better, to make sure that, in the future, should either COVID-19 continue or we have other future pandemics, how do we cope and recover better? As well, as I mentioned, the governance arrangements are critical, the financial mechanisms, as well as the implementation considerations that we need to have in place for the recovery framework. What are the coordination mechanisms that we have in place? We have so far a team of about 25, 26 people looking at the different sectors: agriculture, gender, health, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, governance. And then we meet every 2 weeks to check the progress, consult, discuss where we can find missing information. There is also interdepartmental technical team from the African Union, which meets monthly, to review and also monitor the progress that we are making. There's also a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary with membership from the Africa Working Group on DRR, the members to review, to endorse the recovery tasks that we are undertaking. And of course, the last part of the coordination mechanism is a high-level policy engagement with the Assembly of the Union, African Union, the Executive Council, and specialized technical committee guiding the process. These are some of the team members. We're not all of us here, but that gives you a sense of the team that's involved in the drafting of this framework. What are some of the results that we are seeing emerging from this recovery process, the recovery framework? As I mentioned, we looked at the baseline, but also then looked at what has changed and what are the implications. We looked at the health consequences, macroeconomic effects, human impacts. Human impacts here, it's really putting the face or bringing the human face to the whole COVID-19. What has been the implication on poverty, vulnerable groups, gender, but also the Africa progress on SDGs? What also are the economic outcomes that we are seeing, the changes we're seeing as a result of COVID-19? So again, here is the changes we've seen in trade, in agriculture, the informal sector, but also what are the changes we are seeing in cross-cutting issues such as social protection, governance, gender, migration, and so on and so forth. This is probably too small for you to read, but I can just pick out a number of some of the findings that we looked specifically from the SDGs. In the interest of time, I'll just pick a couple. So for example, on target SDG goal number 1, Africa so far, we've seen 29 million more people being pushed into poverty as a result of COVID-19. On the food side, we've seen 46 million more people being pushed or being undernourished in 2021 as a result of COVID-19. And we also expect 64 million more people by 2030. With, for example, education, we have seen 327 million students affected by COVID-19, by school closures, and we are seeing an increase of school dropout. When you combine all these things with, for example, reduced access to food and malnutrition, poverty, we are seeing more and more children being pulled out of school, but there's also a gender dimension to this. We are seeing more girls being pulled out of school. We are seeing huge number of young girls being married as a result of COVID-19. I also picked one on gender equality, where we're seeing a huge decline in women's employment and income. This is because largely women in Africa work in the informal sector, and the informal sector has been one of the hardest hit sectors in Africa. And also, the informal sector tends to be invisible in our national accounting systems. We've seen the invisibility of the informal sector in the stimulus packages that the African governments have taken. So we are seeing a huge impact in this regard as well. I may also maybe quickly look at one on climate change and sustainable cities. We've seen actually a short-term reduction in pollution, particularly greenhouse gas emissions. This again is linked to the closures and lockdowns. And we've seen a huge improvement in air quality in some of our urban areas, but we expect that this is only in a short term, and we might see an accelerated increase of greenhouse gases as our economies pick up. So we're seeing that there's a huge impact actually on all SDGs, or I should say in all African SDGs. What are some of the recommendations we are making? Maybe some of these I can just touch upon quickly because most of these have been implemented. For example, we are seeing huge revamp of the health systems in Africa. We've actually improved in a number of areas. At the same time, COVID-19 has taken away resources from other health sectors as well. So, how do we effectively implement health systems reform? We've seen, reopening of schools, safe reopening of schools. We've seen a huge expansion of social safety nets in Africa to address increasing poverty and make recovery more inclusive. We've seen also acceleration, maybe not so much in some parts of Africa, but the vaccination program. And one thing that we are all, kind of mentioning, but we're not yet seeing the results, is the whole issue of green recovery. In the medium term, some of the recommendations being made is, addressing increasing liquidity and debt sustainable issues using international debt initiatives. Refocus on SDG priorities, invest in an SDG push, for particularly poverty, education, health, food security, and nutrition. Africa is an agro economy. So again, there's need for us to invest a lot in agro industry, production systems, food, fisheries, forestry, and so on and so forth. In the longer term, we are looking again at more how do we promote integration and collaboration between regions, including the FCT, FTA. We know that Africa still prefers to trade with partners outside the continent than with its own neighbors. We should also give priority to countries with significant increase in extreme poverty. How do we invest more? The social protection and also legislation to make sure that no one is left behind. This is at the policy level. At the programmatic side, I can pick up one is how do we build more comprehensive social protection systems? So what are the next steps as we move forward? As I mentioned now, we are conducting focus group discussions with RECs and the member states, but also civil societies, private sector, women groups, and development partners and others, just to get also their perspectives into the framework. From November to December, we'll be undergoing the review process, the AUC and REC internal review, UNDP internal review, but we also want to make sure that we have independent reviewers analyzing the report. We'll also be presenting the draft framework to the Special Technical Committee. I think that's in December, to also make sure that we're on the right track. And of course, discussion and endorsement of the framework with the African Union at the African Union Summit in February. Beyond that, it's really disseminating the framework to the member states, but also following up and supporting the member states in the actual implementation of the framework. For colleagues online, you might be wondering, how can you participate in this process? We look to your support in reviewing the COVID-19 recovery framework to make sure that it's really robust, but also reflects the realities on the ground that you have in your own countries. We would like your support in providing data. We shared a web survey. If you can again help us in filling those surveys with the information that you have at the local and the national level, but also promote and advocate for the framework at the national level, but also with your own development partners, private sector and NGOs, as well as leverage the framework for resource mobilization. The framework is good as it is, but without the resources in place, I don't think we're going to make much progress. And of course, as I mentioned, this then also affects that Africa is making the progress that Africa is making on the Sendai framework. Thank you very much, and over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I'm just looking here to see if there are any questions. I think your presentation was excellent, comprehensive, and I'm very pleased to see that it is. Okay, thank you very much. We're back live. I apologize for a little bit of a technical hitch that we're having. I guess we're about to conclude. We have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to just maybe just say a few words on the last presentation by Cecilia, and maybe pose just a couple of questions to the participants. First of all, I just wanted to emphasize, Cecilia's mentioning of the importance of governance, finance, and looking at institutional alignment and the accountability when it comes to the COVID framework. And that sounded to me like really the backbone of to deliver on the recovery from COVID. And I think that's quite important. The other point I thought was interesting, and it's about the COVID being sort of an illustration of the systemic challenges we have when it comes to risk. By that, I mean the interconnectedness of risk and the cascading nature of risk. And I think that was really important to mention, and the COVID-19 just really brought that to the fore. So thank you very much for that. Depressing a little bit about the effect on children and girls when it came to COVID-19, the dropout from school, and the amount of the poverty that has resulted out of that because of people, especially women in the informal sector, being out of work. But I do think it also brought to the fore the importance of how this really links to all the 17 SDGs on your last chart there that you showed and illustrated some areas that were, I thought, important. Now, I just want to maybe just pose a couple of questions to you. Maybe I think maybe Kai could answer this, but I know Cecilia is also capable. Why is data governance so difficult?
No, thank you, Amjad. I think we lost you, but I think we got the. Thank you, Amjad. I think we got the gist of the question before we lost you.
I'm back.
The issue about data in Africa, I can start, and I'm sure my colleague Kai will also share on this, because I share with him the frustrations of accessing data in Africa. There are a number of reasons. One, data is very expensive. Because to really understand what is happening, whether we're talking about disaster risk reduction or COVID-19, you need to continually collect data. It's not just a one-off exercise and then that's it for the rest of 10 years. Data actually gets obsolete within a year or two. And so collecting data is a very expensive exercise. And of course, in Africa, with resources stretched so much, there's so much that can be allocated to data. The other challenge we have with in our continent is the institutionalization of data. Who is responsible for collecting disaster data? This still remains a challenge in Africa. We have the national statistics officers. They collect a specific type of information, but it's not always the type that we need to really understand what is happening in our own continents on disaster risk reduction. Data is also a power. It's powerful. Accessing data is a challenge, even within the government institutions. You keep the data to yourself. It also gives you an upper arm or negotiating space. So let me just stop here quickly, because I see the time is going, but also give a chance to Kai to share from his side as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, Kai, go ahead.
Well, no, it also relates to capacity as well. Just building on Cecilia. In many institutions in Africa, you only have few, maybe 3 or 4, working on disaster management institution. And you cannot do much, even in collecting data. I think the issue of capacity is very important. The technology is another problem. But again, what is important is issues to do with legislation. I think there have been lack of strong legislations that motivate other sectors to give data to disaster risk management institution. I think that is really where it becomes difficult, for disaster risk institution to collect data related to drought, we are sitting in different ministry, or on bridges, we are sitting on different ministries. So I think the issue of legislations that should motivate, other sectors to work together is a very, very important element. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. I think we've reached the end of the meeting. I'm very pleased to and honored actually to be able to have you with us today, and we'll take some of the messages that you brought to us forward as we go throughout, and maybe even reflect the importance of data and COVID recovery in the declaration that we want to adopt at the end of this conference. And I would also, just to emphasize again the issue of systemic risk and challenges, and also remind the audience that tomorrow at 11 o'clock, there will be a specific session on risk governance in the context of systemic risk and COVID-19, which will augment some of the discussions that we've had today. And I think we need to look at the conference really as a whole, as many parts coming together to address disaster risk reduction challenges, solutions, and recommendations in a comprehensive manner. Thank you very much to both of you, and it's a real pleasure and for you to take the time and speak to us today. And we look forward to see you throughout the rest of the couple of days of the conference. All the best to all the participants. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy your afternoon.